Hello, this is Brian Keckler, Quality Manager for Smithers Quality Assessments. In this presentation, I'm actually going to be covering a couple of topics. The first one being findings and results from the SQA witness audits that we do internally. And the second topic will be with regards to the IATF internal audit results. So for the first topic regarding our internal SQA witness audits, I do want to congratulate everybody because we've actually had no formal nonconformities in the witness audits that we conducted in 2019. Now, granted, we only conducted 5 IATF internal witness audits, but I like to think that the fact that we had no formal nonconformities was not necessarily based on soft grading, but based on the performance of our auditors. So we do feel that we have a very good crew of auditors for the IATF auditing. So we do ask you to keep up the good work. And in this presentation, though, we do want to provide some opportunities for you to consider. So first off, if the client is using things like process turtles or process mapping diagrams, whenever those are being used, we just ask that you take more time during your audit to effectively use those and review those during your audits. Always be sure to ask for them. Sometimes they exist, but they're not readily identified. So you do always want to touch base with the client and ask if they're using any sort of process turtles or other diagrams that outline the processes. And when you review those, you're looking at things like the inputs, the outputs, and then the different legs, the resources, the people, and also significantly would be the measurements or the KPIs that are listed on any of these diagrams. Sometimes these diagrams are very broadly based with vague information and references. And we've seen in some cases where they're not being maintained. We've seen where there's a mismatch, especially in the measurements, not always clearly identifying the various inputs and outputs of the process. So also, we should be utilizing them during our audits, but also take a look at if the client is effectively using them in their own internal auditing process. If not, and if they're not being maintained effectively, then more than likely you have a nonconformance there that can be identified. Another item, in terms of risks and opportunities and identifying action plans, the organization should be doing an ongoing analysis of their risk and opportunities and any subsequent action plans and updates. And this is an input to management review. If you look at the input topics, they should be looking at their risk and opportunities. So please make sure that the client is doing a good job of doing an ongoing analysis, making updates to any of their action plans and updates to any of their risks and opportunities. Likewise, are they updating interested parties and feedback from interested parties? These are some of the core ISO requirements, and sometimes they do get overlooked because they are the base ISO, and we tend not to pull that standard out as much during our audits. But always be sure to have a copy of the ISO standard with you. Don't just audit to the IATF supplemental additional requirements. Make sure you always go back to the base ISO as well. Obviously, as an auditor, try not to inflect too much of your own personal preferences or opinions. We are not there to consult, and it is a fine line that we walk in terms of identifying things as opportunities for improvements, which we've always said in the past to use those very sparingly. And again, you're auditing against the requirements of the standard. There are several ways that those requirements can be implemented. It's not how we personally perceive those as auditors or how we would implement them if we were the quality manager. So please keep that in mind. Obviously, any observations or findings that you identify have to be clearly linked to the IATF requirements. So as you go down an audit trail, and don't get hung up again on personal preferences, and be clear in terms of what the IATF requirement is that you feel is being violated. In the production areas, we can always do more effective use of the FMEA and control plans. It is a requirement for each audit. And in the manufacturing areas, please be sure to use those documents. Part of the contingency review requirement is that the client review their contingency plans by top management. Now, keep in mind, this does not always mean that they have to be reviewing contingency plans at their formal management review. It just has to be evidence that they have been reviewed by top management. Top management in this case does not necessarily mean that it has to be done at management review. They could be reviewing it through other methods. In terms of premium freight, keep in mind that the IATF standard uses a very precise word here. They use the word occurrences. So oftentimes we do see clients will track things like premium freight dollars. Also make sure that they are tracking actually the number of occurrences. They can be slicing and dicing premium freight however they want, as long as we get a sense that they are taking into account the occurrences, the number of occurrences of premium freight. As far as client pre-planning data, I would say just be sure that the client is submitting all of the required items. Don't let them get away with not necessarily submitting items, and be sure if there are items that are not being submitted that you are in fact adding time to the pre-planning hour. Even if it's a half hour, we do suggest adding time in half-hour increments. This is partially for billing purposes, but also how we show the time overall. The expectation is that you should be adding time if the client is not submitting all the required pre-planning information. And if the client consistently refuses to provide the required information, then you probably should be writing a nonconformance against that as well, since it is a requirement of the rules that would be applicable to write that as a nonconformance. As you know, we should always review scorecards during the pre-planning hour. One of the things, try not to get too sidetracked in reviewing the actual OEM nonconformances during that pre-hour. I know we ask you to take a look at how many nonconformances they have and maybe take a quick look at their customer complaint tracking. But then as far as getting into the detail of each of the nonconformances, that should be planned for later on in the audit when you follow up in the corrective action process, or when you follow up in appropriate audit trails during the audit. So yes, we are expected to look at nonconformances, but make sure you use the pre-hour time effectively to make sure you do get through all of the OEM and customer portals appropriately. If you start going down into each of the individual nonconformities, I've seen where that has actually taken up too much of the pre-audit hour. So you would follow up later in your audit in that case. So again, congratulations. We do have a few more witness audits planned for later into 2020. We haven't necessarily done any so far this year due to the COVID crisis, but we do anticipate a few later on this year. And we thank you for your support in those processes, and keep up the good work. Second topic here is in terms of IATF internal audit nonconformances. I'm not going to go through all the results in great detail, but I'm just summarizing here some of the results from the 2019 audits and what I'm seeing so far from the 2020 internal audits. So the 2020 internal audit is still in process of being completed, but there are a few points here. And just kind of summarizing them in general in terms of how you as the auditor can help support reducing internal audit issues as well. One of the things that I've seen is with regards to the submission or the retention of the pre-audit letter. Now you send that pre-audit letter to the client, and I'm seeing that the pre-audit letter as completed by the client is not always being provided with the stage 1, stage 2, or the surveillances. Primarily with stage 1 and stage 2s. I see this a lot in China. Obviously the client is submitting the pre-audit data, but the pre-audit letter that is filled out by the client oftentimes is not included in the audit package. So please be sure to submit that for each audit. If you're assigned on a stage one audit, I have identified some discrepancies on information that's on the SQA pick sheet, not always being accurate, especially with regards to some of the audit durations. The information is not being transferred properly to that document. So don't simply rely on the SQA pick sheet or the audit duration that's given to you by the office. Especially on a stage one, you should be confirming those durations and the calculations. We do provide a complete copy of the quote and quotation information when you're doing a stage one. So always compare that to the quoted time against the current head counts and run through the calculations yourself. And if you see any concerns with the audit durations, obviously you do want to report those and any discrepancies to the SQA office as soon as possible, especially before proceeding with your stage two audit, as well as when you do your pre-planning for surveillances. Always do a verification of the audit durations, and if there's any questions, definitely contact the office. Wrong revisions of forms, there's another big one. Always be sure that you're using the current forms. We're trying to do a lot now as we migrate to BOSS to get the forms updated and user-friendly formatting. So we are going to be posting the latest version of the forms right on the audit cards, and in BOSS it links to the latest forms. So always be sure to download the current forms, whether you're currently doing that through the SharePoint portals or as we migrate into BOSS. I think some of the issue here occurs when the tendency might be to type over a previous plan or a previous report, or understand we do a lot of pasting of information amongst documents, and just be careful when you are pasting information from other documents or previous reports so that you're not losing any sort of revision level content. Sometimes the information in the previous report may not be to the latest expectations and contents on the current form. So please use extra caution, making sure you're using the correct forms, and extra caution when pasting information. We've mentioned surveillance reviews and some of the external nonconformances. So again, timely submission of your surveillance files is equally as important. And any sort of review findings, we are currently processing those through emails. You might get an email from the reviewer or from the OSC. You are expected to respond to those review findings in a timely manner. Eventually in BOSS, we will be migrating to a more automated process with the review findings. But for now, please respond to those in a timely manner through the emails that are provided. From the internal audits, there have been other office-related findings, things like the automotive representation on the impartiality review process. We made some changes in the application review and quotation process concerns, some updates to forms and things like that. We continue to find concerns with the IATF database audits, so the accuracy of your information in your reports and packages is very important to that. We've already mentioned surveillance reviews, so there are other findings, but not as many in terms of the office issues that are always relevant to the auditors. So just a handful of items here from the internal audits and things that you should be aware of as the auditor. So that ends this particular presentation. And again, thank you. Hope you find this information informative and helpful.